I used to call it America, but I don't anymore because America is a concept, not a place. So now I just call that geographical area the US because increasingly it's just like all the other 200 countries in the world. This is all quite inevitable. Actions have consequences. Cause has effect. You jump off a 100-story building, you'll pass 99 floors on your way down to hitting the ground. And I've been buying gold since about $45 an ounce. Back when I didn't have any money, $45 was worth a lot more then than it is now. And I've never sold an ounce, so I've got a bunch of it. So yeah, I'm happy about what's happening with gold. I'm not happy about the reasons why it's going up. Basically, I've been saying for years that we are entered upon something called the Greater Depression. Forget about what the government says about 2 quarters of down statistics mean you're in a recession. They never define the word depression. It's a period of time when most people's standard of living drops significantly. And the fact is that the average North American standard of living has been dropping in many ways, not always, in real terms since the early 1970s when the dollar was cut loose from gold. And, the whole world, but especially North America, is built on a pyramid of debt, phony money printed by the central banks. It's going to end badly. So what's the nature of this depression, the Greater Depression? It's not going to be like the one from 1929 to 1946. It's going to be longer lasting, it's going to be different, and much more unpleasant. Starting in the early 70s, when the dollar was cut loose from gold totally, that's when inflation has been getting out of control. The government has gotten bigger and bigger. Most people unaware of the fact that before World War I, the U.S. government lived entirely on import duties and excise taxes, very little else. It was a very prosperous and very free time when the government only absorbed a few percent of the GNP. Now, and you can't believe the numbers really, they're all fudged, very complicated. Probably takes about 40% or more of the GNP, misallocates it, dissipates it. So the standard of living of the average person in the world goes up for 2 reasons. Number one, the average guy produces and he consumes, but he produces more than he consumes and he saves the difference. That builds capital. Standard of living goes up as you build capital. Second thing is technology keeps building upon itself at the rate of Moore's law. So those 2 things together have made things better. Meanwhile, state intervention has been making things worse. And I think we're in for a real catastrophe, despite those 2 long-term things, which will make the world better over the very long term. Over the short term, the next 5 or 10 or 15 or 20 years, and that's barring World War III, which is quite possibly on the horizon as well, we're in for some tough times. And I've been saying that for years. The government has granted itself the power to take much more control of the economy. 20 years ago, it was considered scandalous if they were running a 20 or 30 or $50 billion deficit. Now, they're running an annual $2 trillion deficit. And it's gone past the point of no return because interest rates that the government pays alone are over $1 trillion per year. And interest rates are going higher. We're actually in a doom loop at this point. And what's happening to those deficits that the government runs? It used to be we could peddle them to the Japanese or the Chinese or other foreigners. It's not possible anymore. They're liquidating the U.S. government debt that they have, the government paper, the dollars that they have. So what's happening to that $2 trillion deficit? How's it being financed? That paper is all being sold to the central bank, the Federal Reserve, and they credit the U.S. government's account at commercial banks with Federal Reserve notes with dollars. And that increases the money supply. And that increase in the money supply is what drives up prices, drives up all kinds of prices, drives up stock prices though. That's considered good inflation. But it also drives up the prices of the things that people buy to live on. That's considered bad inflation. Fact is, it's all bad inflation because that money, that phony money, that fiat money that spews out of Washington and New York flows first into the hands of the elite, the government, top people. They get it first. And then as it goes down, it loses value. So we, the people, just get the table scraps that are left after these guys drink from the fire hydrant of money that comes out of DC and New York. Almost all the governments of the world are bankrupt. Almost all of them are being criminally mismanaged. In fact, the only one that's not is where I am right now, Argentina. It doesn't matter if he reduces nominal income taxes or whatever. The only way you can reduce taxes is by reducing spending. Because when the government spends, it's going to extract that money from someplace, which means from its subjects. And his idea about raising import duties is a disastrous idea. That was what actually set off the last depression in 1929. When you make it impossible to import, because imports are so expensive, the people that are supplying those imports don't have money. And then they can't buy from you, or can't buy from each other either. So to solve the problem, you have to radically cut spending. Not treat this like some type of a Rube Goldberg machine where let's push the switch and change that. You've got to abolish the whole damn thing. I like to say these things, although I know that it's pointless because it's not going to happen. But I think it is important to put the meme out there so that, because a lot of people have never even thought about this. And I have a lot of confidence in Musk. Musk is a genius, having created 3 huge, gigantic, successful businesses in a short period of time. I don't have much confidence in Trump, frankly. I really enjoy listening to him talk. He's quite entertaining. But the problem with Trump is that he has no philosophical core. He's an ex-liberal Democrat that still has these basic liberal Democrat values. What I like about Trump, and what puts him head and shoulders above that mental and moral midget Kamala, is the fact that he's a cultural conservative. He doesn't want to overthrow the basis of the country. And that's what the Jacobins, represented by the Democratic Party, that's what they want to do. They want to rip the old culture out and replace it. They want to see something like what happened in China during the Great Cultural Revolution. They're very dangerous. And when I said they're Jacobins, I mean it. They have the same political philosophy. They have the same psychological makeup as the Jacobins after the French Revolution did. They're very, very dangerous. It's realistic to believe that Kamala could be installed as president. This shows you how far the U.S. has devolved. Well, I guess they can cut rates as far as they want, but those are only short-term rates. The more they cut rates, the more money is going to be financed by the government, and the more fiat is going to be created to cover that deficit. Long-term interest rates will reflect the credit risk, and it's not out of the question that the U.S. government could default on its gigantic debt. I know that sounds incredible to say, but governments do it all the time throughout history, and the U.S. could join that party. People forget that in the early 80s, the U.S. government itself was paying 15 to 18% for money. That's what interest rates were back then. And the situation is much, much more serious now than it was back then. So from here, I think interest rates are headed way up. They fell for about 40 years from the early 80s to 2022, and they're headed back up, but this time with a vengeance. And those high interest rates are going to have lots of serious knock-on effects, but some of them will be good. One of the good things is it will cause people to borrow less, consume less, and save more. Although it's very dangerous saving with dollars, because the dollar is a floating abstraction, and it's going to reach its intrinsic value sometime in the not terribly distant future. I don't know why people have substantial positions in bonds. They're a triple threat to your capital. You've got the interest rate risk. Interest rates double, which they will in the foreseeable future, and the value of your bonds roughly falls in half. You've got the default risk, which is a real risk now, even on government paper. And you've got the inflation risk. You can get your interest in capital in dollars, but they're going to be worth a tiny fraction. I own a couple of bonds that are convertible bonds for mining companies. Okay, I'm buying them because of the convertibility option, but other than that, I wouldn't touch bonds. I wouldn't doubt that in 30 years, the map of the United States is going to look different than it does now. I wouldn't doubt that we're going to have secession movements in the U.S. There's a lot of possibilities. Maybe all the Hispanics in Southern California and other places will decide, wait a minute, I don't want to pay 25% of my income, which is where it's going to go, for Social Security alone to support some old white broad in Massachusetts. Maybe they're going to secede. You saw this recent movie, Civil War. It's not far off from what could happen. So I wouldn't plan 30 years ahead. I wouldn't plan on the U.S. government being able to pay its debt 5 years from now. And we're not even talking about the very real possibility of World War III, which these neocons in Washington, they're prodding the bear. They're just asking for trouble in any number of places, and somebody's going to give it to them. I like them both. And the reason is it's always been true of gold, but now it's becoming true of Bitcoin as well. They're the only financial assets that are not simultaneously somebody else's liability. In other words, you don't have to rely on somebody to make good on a promise with them. If you own them, you own them. And gold, you have it in your hand. Bitcoin's a little bit more problematical because it's just a digit on a computer, but it's an excellent transfer device. And in today's world, where the next thing governments are going to be doing all over the world is putting on foreign exchange controls, which is going to make it very, very hard and costly for you to get your money out of a given country. So that's where Bitcoin shines especially. One of the nice things about Bitcoin is for the younger generation, it kind of is they had to figure out what's the value proposition in Bitcoin. And young people figured out that they needed some alternative to the fiat dollar. Now, many big people call the dollar the fiat dollar because it's made out of nothing. And people weren't really thinking that way so much before Bitcoin came up. So Bitcoin is kind of a gateway drug to gold. People realize that the dollar is a floating abstraction. It's the on-back liability of a bankrupt government. So they want to dump it. They don't want to use it. They don't want to trade between each other where everything clears through New York and put themselves at the discretion of the U.S. government. Look what happened to the Russians. They lost hundreds of billions of assets just because Washington decided that, yeah, we want it, so we'll take it from you. So it's a good idea that they're getting away from the dollar. I mean, the dollar has been the major export of the U.S. for the last 40 years. It hasn't been Boeings, it hasn't been wheat, it's been dollars. Trillions and trillions of dollars are outside the U.S., and they're hot potatoes because nobody has to hold them. They're just convenient for the moment. So this new currency that they're talking about, it's a good idea to have an alternative. But the Russians, the Chinese, the Indians, the Iranians, the Brazilians, there's no reason for them to trust each other. Having a common currency actually doesn't make realistic sense. They already have one. It's called gold. So you don't need 40% gold backing, 100% gold backing, and you don't need a currency. You just need the metal itself. That's all. That's the way it was before the last depression. But it's a good idea. They're going to go to gold is the answer to the question because they don't trust each other. And that's why they've all been buying gold. And the public isn't involved in gold yet. It's mostly these central banks that are trying to dump each other's fiat funny money. And they're buying gold. What else are they going to buy that they can use as a money? I mean, you can't use cattle as a money, can't use wheat as a money, can't use artwork as a money, can't use lead as a money. Nobody can store that much of it. That's why gold has always been used as money. It's uniquely suited and well qualified for use as a money. It'll be reinstituted. It will use gold in daily commerce, unless, of course, the world turns into a police state first on the way. Well, I think they'll continue buying it, quite frankly, and all through the Eastern Asia. Well, not everywhere, but certainly in China and Thailand and India. I haven't been to China for some years, but it amazed me. There are gold stores everywhere in Beijing and Shanghai. The average Chinese guy is very used to accumulating gold, and that's still true today in Southeast Asia. I mean, they don't want to hold this, some paper money that can be crumpled up and dry. And they all buy gold. Their savings are in gold, which is very intelligent, unlike North Americans who don't do that. They hold paper, which is bad enough, and it's in banks, which is even worse because I don't know what's going to happen to these banks. I mean, most of them are bankrupt, frankly. And of course, if the government bails them out, it can only do that by creating lots and lots more fiat monies. They're in a death spiral at this point in North America, in addition to the fact that the political leadership in both countries is criminally bad. Well, maybe one endgame is like that movie, Civil War. Maybe World War III is another endgame. That could be even worse. So what's the endgame? There's a primary rule of life, and it's like the prime directive of life. It's survive at any cost. And it doesn't matter whether you're an amoeba or a person or a government, you do whatever you can to survive. And a government, of course, since it's got guns and all kinds of power, will do whatever it needs to. It might default on its debt. It might just, who knows what it'll do. But they're in a desperate situation right now. So the government will look out for number one. They'll take care of themselves. Forget all this nonsense about we'll do what's best for the people. I mean, anybody that believes that's going to get what they deserve. No, the government takes care of itself and its own and its supporters and its sycophants. So that's what they'll do, because the government produces nothing. Whatever it does to survive itself will be at the expense of its subjects. But I don't think people are paying adequate attention to how serious the situation is.